Hello, everyone in person and online. My name is Jackie Rose. I am a professor in the Western Washington University Behavioral Neuroscience program. And on behalf of the local organizing committee, I want to welcome everyone here to the 2023 Faculty for Undergraduate Neuroscience Summer Workshop. Yay! So I'll begin with our land acknowledgement. Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people, who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed. From time immemorial, we express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Thank you. So, to provide some context for those of you who are joining us for this presentation who are not affiliated with this conference, this is the keynote presentation for the Faculty for Undergraduate Neuroscience Summer Workshop. The Faculty for Undergraduate Neuroscience, aka FUN, of course, that's what we're known for, FUN, is an international organization that supports neuroscience research and education, specifically at the undergraduate level. So we have attendees present here today, as well as FUN members joining online from all over the country. So welcome, everybody. Yay. The Faculty for Undergraduate Neuroscience, WW Behavioral Neuroscience Program, and the WW Alumni Office are excited to welcome you to today's keynote presentation, Towards an Anti-Racist Neuroscience, Education as a Foundation for Social Justice, and our speaker, Dr. Oliver Rollins. Dr. Rollins completed his PhD in medical sociology at the University of California, San Francisco, and then was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and is now an assistant professor of American Ethnic Studies, as well as a research affiliate of the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology at the University of Washington, just 2 hours south in Seattle. Over his career, Dr. Rollins has received grant funding from the National Institutes of Health, as well as the National Science Foundation, and has recently published a book titled Conviction, The Making and Unmaking of the Violent Brain, which many of us in the room here got a chance to discuss earlier this morning. So before I turn it over to Dr. Rollins, though, I have a few housekeeping items. For those people joining online, some of you have submitted questions with your registration, and we appreciate those. And if any other questions come up during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature, the Zoom Q&A feature, which you should be able to see at the bottom middle of your screen. There'll be time for questions at the end of the presentation, and we'll take questions obviously from people who are in person, as well as people who have submitted questions in the Q&A, and we'll do that at the end of the presentation. So also recommend to use the speaker view if you are joining on Zoom. So without further delay, welcome please, Dr. Oliver Rollins.
All right, thank you, Jackie. So can everyone hear me? Cool, all right. I'm going to first share my screen, so bear with me if we have some technical problems. All right, so hopefully everyone online can see that now, and if not, someone please type in and let me know. Thank you, Jackie, for the introduction. Thank you guys for having me here. As Jackie said, the title of this is Towards an Anti-Racist Neuroscience, Education as a Foundation for Social Justice. So I'll just say just a little bit about kind of where I'm at in my research and why this talk is kind of really pertinent to what I'm doing as well. So as Jackie mentioned, I have a book called Conviction, where I looked at social ethical implications of the neuroscience of antisocial behavior or criminology and violence. And from that book, right, one of the things I wanted to do in that book was to really think about how does like the neurosciences think about race, right? And really what I ran into in that book is that that's not quite what these scientists were doing, right? And so I didn't really get a grasp of like, what is it that neuroscientists think about with race, right? And so I had a second project that I began where I was really looking at neuroscientists who study implicit racial bias and thinking about how do you operationalize race and racism within neurobiological models or neuroscientific models, neuroimaging, right? And then that project actually spent off to another project, which is really kind of the foundation for some of this talk as well. And an ongoing new project as I got to another institution was to think about the relationship between social justice and the neurosciences, really science, but mostly focusing on the neurosciences, right? And there, I'm really trying to think through, particularly after the summer of 2020, right? Both how, I'll talk a little bit about in the talk, how science in general responded to the summer of 2020 and the opportunities it opened for us to kind of think about social justice, right? What that meant, how you do it within your classrooms, how it impacts your work, right? How we rethink our work, all of those things. And so partly for me has been an exercise in both, like I teach classes both within sociology, I'm a sociologist by training, within American ethnic studies, and a lot kind of within science technology studies. So I do and teach a lot of very interdisciplinary audiences, right? And so partly is like, these are kind of lessons for like how I've been in the classroom thinking about how do we move toward, let's say, social justice or move toward what we're thinking about is like an anti-racist neuroscience. And so that's what I'm wanting us to both think about and kind of what I'm hoping to convince you in my talk. So the overview for the talk today, then we'll focus on more or less kind of three things, right? This need to discuss race and science, once again, the need to correct what I may call misreadings of race and racism, right? And then the need for an anti-racist neuroscience, right? And so in those three parts is what I'm hoping to talk about today. So I want to start though with this more or less a straightforward kind of question, right? And that is, why should the neurosciences understand race and racism in society today? Like, why is this important? And actually, this came to me, right? This question actually was presented to me in a guest lecture that I gave for a colleague who's in the room in one of their classes. And a student actually during that time, so this professor assigned my book in their class, right? And a student, right, I kind of asked this question as we're sitting around, what did you think about the book, right? And mostly, and if you were in the probably reading groups today, you probably were thinking very similar, like this book is kind of hard to read, like I don't understand what the hell he's talking about sometimes. That's fair, because it's a different kind of way of thinking about things, right? But the other thing that the student raised, and I thought was a really interesting question, and it was a really brave question to ask too, was that when they first got this assignment that they were going to be reading this book, the sociological book, they really asked, like, why are we reading this book within a basic neuroscience class? Like, what's the point? Like, I thought this was like neuroscience. Like, why are we, didn't say wasting time, but why are we, why should we be reading this, right? And so that actually made me think a lot about how do you answer that question, right? Like, if you were assigning my book or others' books who deal with, let's say, questions around social inequality within science and technology, and you're wanting to teach this, like not in your neuroethics class, but in your actual class, which is one of the arguments we make, right? It doesn't need to be in a separate class. We need to have them almost embedded kind of ethics in what we do, right? So how do you convince your students in a way, right, to take this serious and why this is serious, right? And so I tried to like think through that question since it was raised. And here's some of the answers that I came up with. So one was by reading sociology, by reading the social sciences, or by reading just critiques that kind of think about the science in that way, one, it gives us a space for interdisciplinary exchange, critique, and advancement, right? One of the things we hear a lot on most campuses is that we need more interdisciplinary work, cross-disciplinary work. In fact, we even say part of the way in which we can move toward a more ethical kind of more socially just sciences to bring in people from the other disciplines that are not in science, right? This allows us to kind of have that space and partly kind of that language to kind of think about that by reading this within the class and also getting your students used to understanding those types of terms, the approaches that others are taking to think about the production of knowledge. It teaches us to discuss the social meanings and factors that impact our experiences in and out of the lab, right? Earlier, me and Jackie were kind of having a conversation where I was telling her, like, I was a biology student as an undergrad, and then I moved into Black studies, and then I moved into sociology, right? And part of the reason, right, I left, I think, out of the biological sciences when I was young was there wasn't a lot of talk about the things that I felt that mattered to me, right? And it wasn't a way of like really connecting those things, although now I know there's a lot of ways in which you can connect back all of those things into like the experiences of Black folks from several different kind of, positions or social locations, right? And that's something that I think we could be thinking about of like when folks decide to leave the sciences, right? Or when they leave certain fields, like what is it that's also pushing folks away, right? Why is it that our science labs look a very particular kind of way, right? Are they speaking to the things and the needs to our students in a more holistic way? It shows us how to discern the deeply embedded function of race and racism. And here I really want to highlight one of the things I'm going to talk about in the talk, and one of the things I think that happens a lot, right? Not just within the sciences, but in many times when we talk about race, particularly because I'm using race as kind of my exemplar throughout this talk, is to either think about it as an individual identity or think about racism only as historical misdoings, right? And so we locate racism in the past without kind of talking about how that connects to the present. And we only think about individual kind of identity and not the shared experiences, which really makes up what race is, right? It's about power, it's about a shared experience, it's about collective understandings. And when we do that, I think we deeply, we really limit, right, our students' understandings of like why these things matter, and particularly why they matter outside of, let's say, my classroom in sociology. It prepares us to engage with the politics of science or the politics of knowledge, right? So one of the things I didn't start this talk off with, but I usually start most talks off with, is to say that science is always already political, right? There is no such thing as being, objective, right? I mean, from the questions we ask, from the things we want to figure out, these are political, and not politics in that kind of like red, blue, but the politics in that these things mean something and they shape how we organize society in ways, right? They're trying to answer larger questions. Maybe it's because we find that there's some injustices. Maybe it's because we want things to be easier within society. But either way, they're going to reshape kind of the organization of society in a way, right? That's what we mean by politics within kind of my field, right? That's what politics mean. And lastly, it pushes us to think beyond representation as the sole solution for structural inequalities within science. So this kind of ties to this other one around thinking about the third one about showing us like the deeply embedded function. The other thing, and I won't go on my kind of DEI rant that I go on all the time around like why I think it limits us in some ways, at least the way we present it, is that we also focus on representation much more than the equity and inclusion side of that, right? And so this, at least through my work, I try to force us to kind of think about, well, what does it actually mean to do the equitable side, the inclusion side? Like, what does that mean beyond just representation in that way? And so I want to push us to kind of think about these. So these are kind of the ways in which I thought about like what bringing in, not just sociological texts. I think you can do this with novels. I think you can do this with a lot of different, I use a lot of different mediums. So I use science, journal, articles alongside maybe, not usually my book, but maybe alongside someone within the social sciences, maybe alongside, I don't know, Octavia Butler, right? Alongside someone who does kind of like science fiction, right? And make them read across this, right? And make them see that there are connections in the ways in which we're doing this. Like the production of knowledge is I mean, literally the university has different ways in which we produce knowledge and different ways in which we're kind of saying very similar things and wanting similar things. And students should learn to kind of read across those things to also find connections within their work, right? So in an article that this is, well, obviously that's me at the bottom. And then at the top, that is Professor Dorothy Roberts from the University of Pennsylvania. So me and Dr. Robert, or Professor Roberts, in a piece where we were actually thinking about what we call kind of biosocial science. We also kind of chimed in on that kind of question of why is it important and like what is it that today's science is doing, and particularly like thinking about biosocial science, or the kind of push to think more about the social side of science. And so we argued that the problem here, or I'm sorry, we argued that our analysis does not conclude that biological determinism is inevitable anytime biological sciences or biotechnological approaches to social problems occur. Instead, it demonstrates, or our work demonstrates, that the potential for such technoscientific models and practices, especially in relation to race, suggests seemingly stable and unidirectional kind of unidirectional explanations of causation. So oftentimes when we see biology, we think that we think about it in a deterministic way. And when I say we, I'm not talking about us in a room, I'm talking about us as a society. So it's a question of how people read this outside of our work as well. And so we say that the problem is not the technological usage per se, but it's the ability to obscure our ethical uncertainties and our structural forces, and to reconstitute problematic sociocultural assumptions that researchers relied upon uncritically to execute their work, or biometric surveillance, because we also did a little piece on kind of algorithms and surveillance, right? And really what we're saying here, right, is there a way in which we're not thinking about some of the terms we use, we're not thinking about some of the approaches that we use, and we're not thinking about the embedded ways in which these things kind of impact, these things reinforce social forces within society, right? And so it's not that, so we were trying to make a larger claim around, and I do this in the book too, like this is not really about racist scientists, right? It's not really about deterministic kind of science as much, right? It's about kind of this normative way in which we reinforce in the everyday, right? And our everyday relied upon, teaching, our everyday relied upon techniques that we use within the lab, right? We do things that oftentimes will lend themselves to larger social inequalities outside. And it's not necessarily that we're asking like folks to, we are saying we should figure out different ways, but we're also saying you actually need to be able to recognize that is happening too in the first place, right? And so this leads then to kind of this question around, so why is it that we need to discuss race and racism? And what I wanted to kind of do here in some of this, right, particularly here, to kind of think about how I approach this question within the classroom. So I teach a class on race, science, and technology, or race science, technology, something like that. I can't remember. It's one of the two. Right? So I have a class where I teach on like race, science, and technology. And one of the questions that we try to think about is not just the past, but like contemporary understandings of race and science, right? And I always, want them to kind of what we call kind of historicize this, right? Not to stay in the past, but to really historicize as to how we kind of got here. Like, why does it matter that we're thinking about this right now, right? And where I usually start with, right, is these interesting debates that happened right after World War II. There were the UNESCO debates of 1950 and 1951. So most of us understand, like after World War II, there was a lot of realignment within the world around just kind of these powers, within, at country level, but there was also a lot of discussion about, how do we not go back down that road again? And particularly UNESCO had these two panels that really wanted to think about how should science think about race, right? So under the direction of the UNESCO Director General, right, they were asked to study and collect scientific materials concerning the question of race, to give a wide diffusion to the scientific information collected, and to prepare an educational campaign based on that information, right? So they wanted to say, right, essentially, right, they wanted to kind of think about the fact that how race had thrived, or racial science had thrived before that to lead to the war, to lead to all of those things happening. How do we not go down that path again? What safeguards can we put into place? And what do we actually have to say about this thing? Like, can we come to a consensus about what race means through science, right? And so you actually had two panels. The first panel in the 1950s was made up of mostly sociologists, anthropologists, right? And I'm boiling this down to, a few points for you guys, but it's really interesting. It's a really interesting point time to think about race. So one 1950 panel essentially said that race is ideological, right? That race exists as a both biological race and a social race, right? So they said that there's this thing called race, and there's a biological kind of piece to this, and there's a social piece to this. The biological piece we've never really been able to figure out, right? But the social piece is actually the more dangerous one, right? It's the social one that we've been using. It's the social kind of understanding that we've been using, right? And so they suggested that, the real meaning of race may be biological, maybe, but that social race is more or less a myth, right? And we hear this a lot still today, right? That when people talk about race, and we often say, well, race doesn't actually exist. It's a made up thing, right? And this is not just folks within the sciences. I hear it from folks within sociology, and many of us who study race within sociology are usually like, wait. It's a little bit more complicated than just simply saying it doesn't exist, right? So these scientists, right, or this first group, right, of scientists, right, they really, I won't go over all the claims, but they really want to kind of think both about like how to kind of move past, move past kind of the dangerousness of race, right? To really call it an ideological kind of thing was to say this kind of almost based on ignorance in some ways, right? And that had kind of really been the central kind of focus of how it gets misused. Like people just don't understand, right? That we need a better understanding of these things. 1951, right after that, the second panel was formed. And the second panel was formed mostly because there was a group of biological anthropologists and other kind of what we may call now kind of genetic scientists who disagreed, right, with many of the points that came out of the 1950 panel. But the biggest claim that they disagreed with was not necessarily that race was ideological or that it was a biological meaning. It was that in some ways the 1950 panel more or less said we should close the door on thinking about racial science. The 1951 panel was like, wait, we shouldn't necessarily just close the door because we don't have the tools and technologies to think about these things right now, right? So they say that maybe certain physical traits, certain mental traits are important for the formation of race or the way in which we think about race, and we just don't know it now, right? And because we just don't know it, we shouldn't necessarily close the door. We don't necessarily have the tools, right? We don't necessarily have the kind of technologies right now to really dig into these things, right? And so what sociologist Jenny Reardon says, right? Jenny Reardon is a sociologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the director of their Science and Justice Research Center. And in her book, Race to the Finish, right? And Race to the Finish is really about the formation of the Human Genome Project and kind of, and its twin, right? Because there was a Human Genome Project and there was also a genome project that really dealt with kind of this question of race that kind of died out in the early 90s. And so she's kind of just kind of tracking like how that kind of worked, tracing how that worked, right? And in her analysis of this debate, right, she notes that far from marking the exit of scientists from the social debate about race, the UNESCO statement argued that society would be better off if scientists, with their expert knowledge, played a greater role. So essentially what she says is that it actually didn't close the door, but opened the door. And what makes this important, right, is that because it opened the door, is in part why we are where we are today, right? In some ways, they could have closed the door and just said, this is not something we should be studying. It's not something that we can understand using science, right, in this way, and close the door. But that's not what happened, right? And partly because that's not what happened, it kind of gives us kind of where we're at today. But I always tell my students that we need to kind of historicize this in a way, right? It's not just as people decided today that we want to start thinking about race again. It's, as Reardon said, it never did go away. Like we kept thinking about race in the work that we did, right? We kept thinking about why was race important to, let's say, thinking about criminality, like the stuff that I studied, right? And so because of that, right, the lesson, I guess, that we learned is that, you know, there's a particular type of way in which it opened up both a possibility for us to kind of keep thinking about race, but it also did something else, right? And this is kind of where I'm at in my research too, right? It forced us to kind of think about how race stayed around even when we did not, you know, specifically say race, right? This is what we call kind of the absent presence of race, right? That it's like looming, It's like in the room, even if no one says it, but it's there, and it may be built into what we do. It may be built into our assumptions. It may be built into our behaviors, but it's there, right? And this is more or less, I think, where a lot of us who study kind of race and science are at now, right? We're trying to think about, okay, how do you actually get at not simply when something is like obviously racist or sexist, but when something is not necessarily obvious, but it leads to reinforcing racism, sexism, transphobia, any of those things within society, right? Because that's kind of how it works today, right? That like we're seeing things where it's like, oh, we didn't know that this would actually impact race or impact inequality in that way, right? But it does. So it raises this kind of question of what do we do, right? So what do we do with this question of race? And so I show this article here from Robert Kubela and Sergio de la Sala, where they wrote this editorial called Taking Race Out of Neuroscience Too. And actually this editorial is interesting because it was built off of some of the work that Dorothy Roberts did when thinking about taking race out of genetics, right? And essentially it made this argument that we should also take race out of the neurosciences. And the key to that argument was that there should be kind of a radical ban on the term of race in all the sciences, including the neurosciences, right? So a couple of us, me and two other cognitive neuroscientists, we actually wrote a response to this, and a sense of response, but also there's a larger paper thinking about why we kind of argued the opposite. And it's not necessarily that we were arguing that you should keep race in, but that you can't necessarily just cross out the word race within journals and then say that it's not there, right? Again, kind of this absent presence, right? And so we were drawing from, right, the work of Troy Duster. So if you haven't heard of Troy Duster, he's what we sometimes call, at least what Alondra Nelson has called, the grandfather of race and science, right? He wrote one of the first, probably the first kind of book to thinking about the human genome and its relationship to race and racism. It was called Backdoor to Eugenics in 1991, I believe, right? And Troy Duster, along with many things, he's a mentor of mine as well, but he's really sharp in his thinking about kind of like how race does work in a particular type of way. And so one of the things he says in the article in 2003 was that purging science of race may not be practical, desirable, or even, possible or even desirable for some research questions. What Duster was trying to get at is how do we show racial injustice without talking about race? And yet at the same time, how do we ensure that we're not reinforcing some illogical kind of biological link to race when we do talk about race, right? And he says that's the real problem, right? That we both have to use race to show that there is something wrong. And at the same time, by showing or using race, we can potentially be reinforcing that race is this kind of biological thing, right? And then along with saying it's a biological thing, of course, then it kind of brings up these questions of like natural inferiority and all of those types of things, right? And so he's like, this has always been the kind of the enmeshed kind of like problem with race, right? And particularly with race and science, right? And so we agreed, right? You can't just take race out, right? And partly we said too, you can't take race out because you're not necessarily dealing with that kind of tenacity of race in the sense that it's still there, right? It's still kind of there in that way. And so when I talk about this within the classroom, what I ask my students to kind of think about then is, well, what is race, right? Like if the UNESCO statement was necessarily, let's say, wrong, where does sociology and others stand on this kind of question of race, right? And so here, this is the definition that we use within our article within Cortex, where we argue that race is a socio-political practice, a system of power that has been historically woven into and made culturally visible through the constructed interdependence between supposed obvious phenotypes of difference, skin color, hair texture, and the political governance of society based on unequal interests and values. What the hell does that mean, right? Exactly. So like, this is kind of, I show this to my students because I was like, so if you ask me the definition, I'd probably give you something like this, right? But most people within society will say, what the hell does that even mean, right? Like, I don't know what these terms mean. And I was like, okay, that's right. So let me step back, right? And when I stepped back, I asked my students, I was like, okay, actually, let's not think about a definition of race. let's think about what I call characteristics of race as a social construct, or as I call it, a social process, right? Let's actually think about the characteristics and not trying to figure out some neat kind of definition that can kind of cover all of the things that sociologists have been saying for hundreds of years. And so what I tell them then is to think about, one, race is always already political, right? This idea that when we use race or any of these social locations in some kind of way, we're making something political, right? Ignores the history of those things in the first place, which were already there because of politics, right? They were always there because of the way in which they were organizing society in a way, and they continue to do that work, right? As we talked about, a little bit earlier, that it's more than phenotype, right? So yes, obviously, skin color and these things play a role in how we detect and understand what race is in society, right? And most people, if we would go out in the streets right now and ask them, they would probably give us some kind of definition that has biological in it, right? In fact, I do this with my students. On the first day, I give them a race quiz, right, in my big lecture. And before they walk out, right, I ask them a question, and I always ask, is it anybody in the classroom who has never heard of the term race, right? And of course, no one raises their hand, except some people who try to jokingly say, I've never heard of it. And I'm like, okay, well, you're excused from the quiz. But for everybody else, I'm like, here's the quiz. In 3 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, give me a definition of race, and then you can walk out the classroom, right? And most people get their paper and they start, and then they look up and they're like, oh yeah, I don't know what it is. And then I take it and actually tally up like what they kind of say. So some people say it's kind of a social construct. Some people say it's biological. Some people say it's ethnicity. Some people literally will say, I have no idea what this is, right? But we always get people who say it is biological in some kind of way, right? And largely what we try to tell them is that, yes, biology matters. It is how we identify these things, but there's no way, like there's no genetic kind of understanding. There's no genetic proof of race, nor is there no biological race, right? And I always tell them then, like, when they say this, I'm like, okay, well, if race is biological, or particularly if race is skin color, right? Because someone will say, well, but it is skin color. And I was like, okay, well, if I, because I'm old, took like a Polaroid camera, and we all took a picture of our forearm like this, and I just threw them out in the middle of the floor, you can tell me everybody's race. And they're like, no. And I was like, exactly, because it's way more than skin color. It's way more than eye color. Like, it's all of these things and more, right? These things are these shortcuts that we use, right? But just imagine how often, like when we go through society and we see somebody who does not match what we think they should be. And we always are kind of pause, right? In that way where we're like, what? This is this person's race, right? And the philosopher Charles Mills tells us why we do that, right? He said, because race is real, right? And its existence is a social political existence, not a biological one. And when we meet people, when we do this kind of like race talk in that way, right, through our interactions, he was like, really what we're doing is trying to say, where do you line up on this hierarchy of the ways in which we think about race? How should I approach you and treat you, right? Because we have these learned rules, right? Even when we're not trying to like do them, we all do it, right? And he's like, that is kind of that power of race, right? And it kind of gets to that last part around that race is a socio-political process, right? It happens in the in-between. It doesn't just happen because I'm sitting here and tell you I'm Black, right? I could tell you I'm white, but ain't nobody in here gonna treat me like I'm white, right? So like it's happening in the in-between, in the engagement in that way, right? Which is why it works through power, which is why it structures our society in a hierarchical arrangement, and why it produces real social, economic, and psychological implications. Now, if we think about this today, though, right? Now, I want to I'm kind of shifting gears for us to kind of tie race and racism together and really think about, right, what has been happening kind of within the last few years for us to both have the kind of national conversation that we're not necessarily having, but we act like we're having around race, right? In a way, right, that makes these questions even more relevant, right? And really, I kind of think about this kind of moment within the summer of 2020, right? After the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, where we had these huge uprisings, but we also had interesting responses, right? From a lot of different sectors. And one of them that I thought was the most interesting actually was science itself, right? And the response from science, right, was actually really, really interesting. So you could see from the examples from the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, Nature, Science, right? All of these big publications that we use and we think about is like these flagship publications in our work. We're all publishing these things about not just race or not just racism, but that race and racism were systemic, that we needed to be thinking about how our work within the lab also connects to work outside, right? It was a very different response, right? And I argue that this has been totally different from any response I think that science has had to any of these things, right? And so it raises the question of what was it about summer of 2020? Not simply the way in which the world reacted, but the reaction that came out of science, right, in itself, right? What was it? In fact, so I'm doing part of my kind of project that I'm thinking through now is to use this moment, right, to kind of think about what has changed, and also because over time, thinking about what has been proposed and then what we actually did, right? There was a lot of things that were proposed during that time that we should do, both within our labs or within the university. It's a question of whether or not we actually carried those things out, right? But one thing that was interesting, one of my undergraduate researcher who has been going through like all of these articles, right, is that, so she basically just traced the name George Floyd just to see like how often this has come up. And in Nature alone, over a 2-year period, the name George Floyd came up over 140 times in separate articles, right? So in 140 separate articles, someone said something about George Floyd, right? And to us, right, that signifies that it was attention to this particular type of moment like we've never seen before, right? And it was an invitation too, because you got to remember, like a lot of this, like one of these is mine somewhere here, the Towards Anti-Racism. It was literally because I was asked to do this, right? Someone asked me to write a response, right? So there's a particular type of attention that we're trying to pay, that we're trying to think through. And at the same time, we're also saying we need to be really careful, right? Because in many ways, we've been here before, right? So if we think about in the early 1990s, we thought about cultural competency, and that cultural competency training was going to change everything. And it's largely been thought about as a way that it did not do those things. And in fact, we've been calling for more structural competency, right? Because the cultural competency did not do what it was supposed to do, right? If we think about things like the NIH's in the late 1990s as well, NIH is like turned to thinking about that we have to report race and ethnicity, right? Still today, we're not really sure what that has done for us within the science, like both in the sense of like the science that we're producing, but also the people who are actually getting NIH grants. That hasn't really changed. We're still having problems, and that it looks pretty much the same, right? If we think about this idea of race corrections, right, the idea that we need to actually correct some of the technologies that we use so that it works for certain groups, right? We've seen this most recently with the NFL and the CTE stuff, right? Around where they had like different thresholds for Black players and white players based off of this kind of race correction. So all of these things that were supposed to help us within society, or at least the way in which we thought about we were supposed to do this in society, has not necessarily led to the transformations that we've been wanting, right? Now, part of this, right, to me has been because there's been a misreading or misunderstanding about what these things mean, right? So many of us have probably seen signs like this, right? That racism is a virus, right? That racism, in many ways, ostensibly, right, has been framed, as something that feeds off of kind of the historical ignorance, right? And it reinforces kind of an unequal balance within society. However, if racism is a virus, right, it's like no other we've ever witnessed, right? So I would argue that racism is not a virus, right? That race nor racism are accidental or epiphenomenal. That racism cannot be reduced to simply personal choice or ignorance, right? That it's not a relic of the past, it's not accidental, right? And so it doesn't necessarily operate as some kind of psychological block, right? In fact, racism, right, in itself, the racism, so there's different types of racism, and I won't go back through that, right? But there's different types of ways in which racism operates, but mainly, right, it operates in a very normative way. It's built into the things that we do, right? It's built into our everyday practices, right? And it ends up being in these kind of interesting ways, right? I was actually talking with Jackie about this, right? That it does this kind of work in a way that at least our responses, right, are also then connected to what we can and cannot do based on social relations, right? So an example, and this is one of the things I'm thinking about in my research now, right, I make an argument that there's a connection between these different kind of spheres that we think about within the academic world, right? From funding to publications, to training, to education, right? To ethics, right? All of these things are interconnected in some kind of way, which you can kind of call a neuroscience sphere or neuroscience kind of like world. But all of these things are part of what we all have to deal with all the time, right? Now, one of the responses that we got, that I say people of my ilk who like think about race and science from like either sociological or anthropological point of view, particularly during the Human Genome Project, had made an argument that scientists need to define what they mean by these things, right? So that you guys, when you do research on human subjects, you should say what you mean when you say it's the African-American population, right? One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is where. Scientific articles are like 3 pages. We get like 30. So I have time to write out what I mean when I'm talking about race. I have time to do that long definition that I give. Most of you do not, right? But to me, what's interesting there is that you can't then think about this as racist scientists, or you can't think about this as an individual will, right? It's not a will to do it or not. It's literally a limitation based off of another kind of social world that you have to do, you have to publish, right? But it's a limitation that you really have no control of in some ways, which means that the policy change needs to happen within that world in order for it to change, right? And arguably, I think there's a lot of different connections in like that, where certain policies, normal policies, everyday policies, things that we think about all the time are impeding social justice in a particular type of way. And that's also what we have to be able to see, right? That like, how do we do these types of things? Being able to kind of think about those connections. I know I'm like running out of time, so I'm proud to just jump through some slides for you guys. So I'm gonna come back to these. So how does scientific racism look today, right? So we define scientific racism as the intentional or inadvertent dependency upon scientific data, proof, or above all, authority to establish, reconstitute, and justify biological, cultural, political forms of racial discrimination and structures within society. Again, kind of what does this mean, right? So one, right, when I teach this, I say, well, we need to think about intentionality, right? That scientific racism does not have to be intentional, right? That kind of description that I just gave you, that example, that is a way in which we can uphold scientific racism within society, within the sciences. Nothing about that is intentional, right? The fact that we use things like facial recognition as neuroimaging tasks, right? That's a way to reinforce that race is some kind of way biological, yet not necessarily intentional, right? A lot of the things we rely upon are not necessarily intentional things. In fact, the unintentional mode of racism is much harder to research. It's much harder to understand because it's built into kind of what we do. As I said before, there's a politics of science, right? Scientific proof or knowledge will be used in multiple ways beyond the lab. So we also have to think about, even when we built something that we think is proof of like, foolproof in a way of like, no one can misinterpret like what this means. It will absolutely get misinterpreted as soon as it leaves the lab, right? Because the way in which people pick things up, and I think you guys will probably know this, just if you read something like the New York Times or Washington Post, when they're citing like a neuroscience study, and you're like, that is not what that means. That is not what they even said. Like they literally did not say that, right? But it will get picked up like that within society. And so we actually have to think about then, what is our role then for correcting, or at least helping correct, or at least changing the norms around how science is read outside of the lab, right? That social problems, right? This kind of relationship between social problems and scientific fixes, right? And so the questions asked kind of circumscribe the types of solutions that will be utilized, right? And so this is one of my kind of big sticking points, right? The example I can use, right, is through my own research, like my book research on thinking about the relationship between neuroscience and criminality, right? And so one of the arguments that I kind of asked them, right, if we can, let's say, predict using neuroimaging, predict whether or not someone would be dangerous criminal in the future, right? What exactly are you asking society to do if we scan the 10-year-old's brain and we find that they may actually be a criminal in the future, right? Like, what is that? Because you're circumscribing a particular type of fix, right? A particular type of problem. And maybe the problem is not necessarily the person's brain in a sense, right? But there's a larger kind of societal kind of problem, right? Same thing with a lot of different kind of questions, right? We're circumscribing a particular type of fix, and these fixes tend to be a very individual fix. And I think there's a way in which we can both be talking about individual fixes, but also then keeping attention to the social kind of forces that actually then create these things as problems, right? What that should look like, hopefully at some point in some years we figure that out. But I think we have to kind of be thinking about those things. And finally, this question around scientific progress, right? The scientific and technological process at times outpace social progress, right? And so I think there's this kind of larger narrative, both when we think about social justice or society that is always progressing in the same way that science is supposedly always progressing. But I think we need to sometimes call attention to the fact that it's not always progressing forward. Whatever progress is, it may not always be a linear kind of forward way. And it may force us to kind of think about where exactly are we headed, right? Maybe we're not necessarily headed into some better ways, right? And I think this is a question that we have to ask in society as well, right? I think social scientists have to ask this too, right? Because we also have this idea that everything that we do within society is moving towards something better, and that's not necessarily true either, right? And then those are ways in which we reinforce existing inequalities instead of actually fixing things. So my last few minutes, because I know I'm probably running close to my time, I want to think about kind of towards an anti-racist, or towards anti-racism, or towards an anti-racist neuroscience, right? And so in the piece that I did in Nature, Human Behavior, right, I wanted us to think about, or essentially I was tasked with this idea of like, what's the relationship between like racism and science today? And I was like, maybe we should think about how do you move beyond what we have today and like move towards something, right? So moving towards an anti-racist neuroscience, the reason I purposely kind of use that, right? Because as I tell my students that like social justice or the end of racism, these are not end goals in the way in which we sometimes present them. We sometimes present it like, let's get to like social justice and then we can stop working. And I'm like, that's not how this works, right? Like we have lessons from this. We have historical lessons. If you look at the civil rights movement, right? You didn't get to just stop, right? You didn't get to stop and say we've crossed the finish line now, right? So it's a constant kind of thing. It's a constant struggle, right? And I think it's important for us to tell students that, because I think it's important for them to understand that it is something we would constantly have to keep doing, right? I'm sorry, like it's not, I can't give you that kind of happy ending, like once we reach here, everything stops. That's just not how it works. And so I argue that the path toward anti-racism must revolutionize the very ethical bonds of accountability between the neuroscience and society. More than the neuroethics of race, I'm calling for a new politic, a purposeful, unyielding commitment to social justice. This new politic must pressure colleges and universities to rethink their own investments within racial capital, right? So there's things, right, that I asked that like, maybe we should be rethinking, right? How do you use your position as neuroscientists or as professors within society, within colleges, to think about the ways in which we could reinforce, well, we may reinforce racism throughout just everyday things we do. So the example that I use often is to even think about who are the vendors that we use, right? When we're asking for tools for our, I don't have use fMRIs, but let's say an fMRI, or we're asking for tools within our labs, right? Who are these vendors? Where does this material come from, right? Could we be thinking about like using our buying power, using our political kind of power in that way to be thinking about social justice in a very different kind of way, right? So even though we're still doing our science, we're buying from very particular types of folks, right? We're pressuring our universities to do the very same thing, right? We're doing a very different kind of anti-racism, right? That goes beyond, right, thinking about just basically identity, right? And one of the reasons I kept thinking about this is because as much as I say we need like a neuroscience that thinks about anti-racism, I also thought about the fact that a lot of us don't do work with human subjects. So what does it mean for folks who do neuroscience that are not necessarily dealing with human subjects? Like, how do you be anti-racist? Or even in the science, like how does physics be anti-racist? What does it mean to be an anti-racist kind of physics professor in that way, right? And so to me, right, we have to think beyond representation and think really about those structural kind of things that reinforce inequality and then what we could do in that way. So that could be representation in the sense of like who we bring into our labs and who we work with, right? That's one way, but I think there's other ways, right? And I want to think about other ways in which we can do that work. And so my last slide that I have for us in is really thinking about what is a politic and not just a renewed ethics, right? And so one, I want us to think about like how understanding the social construction of race and how this concept is necessary for the neurosciences to address scientific racism. So to really think about what does it mean to say race is a social construct, thinking about those kind of 8 categories that I have, right? Thinking about power and all these ways that move us beyond kind of representation. To identify what I call the effects of race, which I skipped that slide, but that's okay, I can talk about it in the Q&A. In research, right, in the way in which this is kind of like partly what we made the argument around that De La Sala article, right, around taking race out, is that it may lead to kind of a colorblind, right, what we call kind of a colorblind scientific racism, right, that because race is not there, we don't worry about it, right, even though it still may have these effects, right, within society. To recognize that science is not apolitical, I think I've said this a lot, right, and that it's always already questions about racialized, gendered, and class dynamics within society, right? So in many ways, neutrality is not an option, right? We've already, like I tell my students all the time, like when people say that they're neutral, particularly, you know, when administrators say that we're neutral, I always tell them, like, what does that mean? Because in some ways, they've already chosen a side. They've already said that the way that things are okay. That's a side. That's not, you know, that's not neutral at all. To rethink and challenge then our current DEI responses, right? And again, representation is not enough. And I could talk about this more, but like the main point is that I think what we've done with DEI, the most part, is we've only really done that diversity part. And we've thought about that as the end goal, right? So like once we get diversity within the space, everything else is supposed to take care of itself. That X group that comes in is supposed to absolve all of the things, all of those structural things that we know happen within institutions, right? And a lot of times that means we're putting pressure on mostly our students, our new faculty, right? And our staff who represent these X groups, right? To do that kind of work. And then the last one is kind of this question that I raised just a minute ago, kind of going beyond the human sciences, because I also think many of us who didn't work with like human populations are the ones who are tasked with answering these questions all the time, versus saying, can we be thinking about sciences or neurosciences in a whole, right, to be asking these larger kind of questions within society? Because you can't just have, like I tell my students all the time, like we can't just have the sociologists thinking about this and then across the, you know, across campus, the physicists are like, I don't really care, like that doesn't actually affect me. You will not have an anti-racist campus or you would not have an anti-racist institution. It has to be a collective thing. So what should that look like is the question. And I believe that is my last thing. Yes, okay, I'm done. I'll stop now.
Time for some questions.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Joe Klein. I'm the here. And my question is, how have you collaborated with like student services side of things, knowing that your faculty, and to help encourage this research, encourage this practice of anti-racism and other actions for things in work, knowing that we really need that collective work together for that? So what strategies or practices have you done in order to see that as?
Yes, so the question, correct me if I'm wrong, the question is, how have I collaborated or thought about relationships with administrative services on campuses? So really didn't think about this kind of notion or actually illustrate how to kind of do kind of more anti-racist work. So this is a good question. So right now, I work in American ethnic studies, okay? So partly, in many ways, particularly on our campus, we've been tasked to do a lot of teaching on these issues, right? So a lot of time, much of this comes through our teaching, right? In the ways in which we, collaborate with folks. But what I've been doing a lot lately, right, is actually because I work with mostly folks of your ilk in neurosciences, right? It's actually been to kind of talk with and collaborate with folks there, right? Who like the folks who do DEI there, right? To think about this, actually my next project is to actually work with the folks who do, there's a program on campus, a brains program to actually work with them so they do like DEI for trainees that are coming in from neuroscience, and actually to work with them to both think about in relation to my own research, right, as I'm thinking about what types of policy recommendations we could have, right, to also advise them on that, but also to learn from them of what's already been doing. So like partly what I hear in some of your question and like what I think about a lot is that there are a lot of things that are happening on campuses. And there's often not a lot of talk across campuses of like certain things that are happening on campus that could change things, right? And that does dilute the power then of those things, right? When either certain, when faculty don't know about it or when students don't know about it, right? Or don't know where to go, right? And also the idea that I think some people don't know where to send people either. Right, even though it seems to be pretty clear, like, I mean, there's usually websites, I'm sure like there's usually a website that says you can come here for things, but a lot of people don't know where to go. And also, just like racism within society, I think we all, two things. I think we all kind of run into this problem of thinking, when we think about it as a structural way, it really does become fatigue because you're like, what can I do? Like, what can you really do? And I think that's a real question, and I think it's a real answer too, right? Because it is hard, right? And sometimes it is like banging your head against a wall, right? And I take that serious, right? That like, the work that you do or the work that other people do, it's hard. Like it's hard work, right? And I think the other thing, and I got this actually from some high schoolers that I was talking to, young high schoolers who all want to be neuroscientists that I was talking to, and I realized that like all of them actually have DEI offices on their campuses now, which is kind of crazy because I was like, that's not how I went to high school. I also went to high school in Texas, but like still, that's not how I went to high school. But all of them also point out like the idea that like DEI is failing them, right? That it's not doing what it needs to do, right? And in fact, they say, like one of them kind of said, like when we asked them about DEI, they just like rolled their eyes, like whatever, like it's not doing what it's supposed to do. So I think that happens too, right? That it's like we have a lot of this talk all the time and they don't see change, right? And part of it is like we have to kind of teach them about like, one, how slow change is, but two, that change doesn't just happen in a way that's like this dramatic change. So there are things that are being put in place that will lead to change. And how to convince students of that is actually really hard because I think their everyday lives, they're still feeling this and they understand this. And so that was a long way of kind of answering your question, but yes, and yes, I do. Yeah. Yes.
I hope this doesn't turn into a long rambling comment rather than a question, but so first of all, thank you for coming here and thank you for doing the work that you're doing on neuroscience. It's a huge benefit to everyone here. And I think that we talk a lot as neuroscience educators about being anti-racist in the process of neuroscience education, but it's hard for us to delve into the need to be anti-racist and understanding the content of neuroscience. And part of that is how we've constructed our discipline, right? So if you look at the origin of the term neuroscience, say from the 1950s, it's self-described as a natural science, a life science with some purposeful distance from the humanities and the social sciences, to put it mildly. And the antecedents, as you described, are very much involved in the biological construction of race going back in history to the present. So how do we, given our identities as scientists, how do we learn across those epistemic boundaries that we've been socialized to maintain?
Yeah.
And how do we build our curricula across those boundaries that we grew up within?
Yeah, no, this is actually a great question. And I think it's a question that's kind of, we're all facing in a way, and partly because again, when we think about these other structural things that then impede kind of progress in a way, right? So the actual design of most universities where we're kind of siloed in our disciplines, and not just siloed in the sense that like, we don't talk to other people, but like literally you kind of have to do it because of things like funding, like money, right? You need, as we say, like butts and seats, right? For teaching, right? So you don't necessarily want to share space with other departments because that is how we make money. I mean, it's raise money within the academy, right? And so that stifles a lot of the cross-disciplinary work that actually needs to happen, right? In order to do the things that you're saying, right? And the other, so like coming from, out of Black studies and out of sociology, right? I mean, the other thing that we are really weary of too is that we don't want folks teaching this who don't know what the hell they're talking about either, right? Like that's also a risk as well, right? When we say we need like folks to be thinking about this, but that doesn't mean that everyone should now just be talking about race within their class, right? And so there has to be a particular type of balance. I think there has to be a particular type of institutional policies, right? That go beyond saying you need to take your one diversity class, and call it a day, right? Like, and even now, like I know particularly on my campus, that is exploded into, well, everybody wants to make a diversity class within their departments now because, again, you need money, right? That's you want to have those classes, right, in that way. And so there's a question there then about the way we fund the institutions, which I don't necessarily think we're going to change overnight or even over a century. But like that's a question there, though, that we have to actually tackle, right? It's a question. So for like me, right, I do a lot of guest lecturings, right? So I get brought in not just within neuroscience classes, but in a lot of different classes to do talks like this to students. And I think there's ways in which we can leverage that. We can leverage things like that. I've been asked recently to actually go kind of consult with a master's program in Europe that is actually wanting to build a master's program within neuroscience that focuses on both anti-racism and anti-colonialism, right? And so partly there, like the folks asked, they were just like, we don't know how to do this, right? Like we don't know how to teach this, right? But you also are recruiting students. I think the thing about us now that we're getting a lot of students now who do know this and who do want to engage in these things. And then it kind of puts you back on your heels of like, well, how do I engage in these things, right? Again, going back to like my experiences when, I was in biology, I end up leaving kind of biology to Black studies because that's where this conversation was happening, right? And so I do think there's a way in which we have to do that. And maybe even coming back to that first question of how do we leverage what's already on campus, right? Both in the sense of like official kind of classes, but I think there's also ways in which we can be doing things that are not necessarily official in a way that expose our students to things like this, right? In order for them to have these conversations and making space for those conversations. So I even think like if we made space within like our journal reading clubs to not just be reading things out of, let's say, yes, we should be reading things out of, what's coming out of nature, but maybe also reading something that's coming out around scientific racism that comes out of anthropology or sociology, right? And it needed bringing in the anthropology and sociologists to kind of help us kind of tease out, like, what does that mean, right? But it may be a more slow kind of building than a kind of abrupt thing, but I think there are things that we can do. I hope that kind of answers. Okay, cool. Yes.
Well, I'm gonna, sorry, cut it short because we have dinner next, but I want to thank Dr. Oliver Rollins for